I could still taste the sweetness of the early satsuma as I dumped the rind onto the surface of the perfectly polished coffee table. A half-empty glass of French Bordeaux stood on the table in front of me. For some reason, her words rattled around in my brain for a few moments, searching for a safe place in the depths of my cerebral cortex to bring some clarity to what she intended to say to me. I didn't care. I'd heard it all before. I just hadn't been paying attention until recently. "Maynard, I'm going to go away for a few days to the lake house to unwind a bit and get cleaned up," my wife of 14 years told me as I sat on her horrible wicker couch. There were 3 suitcases by the door. She held the keys to her new car in her hands and a straw hat on her head. "Maynard, would you be a dear and help me carry them to the car?" I looked at her like she had a huge snotty crust on her forehead. Rising from the couch, I picked up the glass and silently walked out into the huge kitchen, poured the Bordeaux down the sink drain and out the back door before settling down by the pool with a fresh Landshark lager in hand. By the time I finished the first bottle, it was gone. I've grown to hate Bordeaux wine, and it's a shame. It's one of the best French wines. It ages very well, and for some reason my wife Cynthia started ordering it regularly when we had dinner at a restaurant and bottles of it started showing up in the house. I think my festering hatred for it took root when I found 2 stems of the leftover vintage on a dresser in one of the guest rooms, along with a pair of gold cufflinks with my initials MB engraved on them. I didn't own or wear gold cufflinks ever. The phone buzzed in my pocket. "Maynard, please remember to feed Thomas and make sure he gets a little walk before bedtime. You know what happens when he doesn't. I just passed out. Thomas is her dog and the damn thing shits on the kitchen floor if he's not let out every night to do his business. He usually walks in the garden during the day, so it's not a problem. It's not my problem, though. Thomas is at the Society Center right now looking for a new human to be miserable. Cynthia just didn't know it yet." After the next 2 mugs, I started to think more rationally. Along with the Bordeaux and that damn dog, another thing had been getting on my nerves lately. This huge, monstrous house. Cynthia had inherited it from her grandmother, and it had been in the family for over 175 years, with each generation adding new houses to it except this one. The house had 8 bedrooms and 7 bathrooms, not to mention 2 front parlors, living room, dining room, library, huge kitchen, and more nooks and crannies than I could ever count. The house had a deep granite-faced basement with a wine cellar, and still had mid-19th century leaded glass windows, and the roof was covered with slate and copper, not shingles. If Cynthia valued anything as much as life itself, it was this house. I hated the hell out of it. And so, at the age of 39, standing in the foyer of the house I hated, I finished my 4th Landshark and looked around carefully. She was due to arrive at the lake house just about now, and if practice was making itself known. The phone in my pocket buzzed. "Maynard, the house, the lake house. Maynard, there's a fire." She spoke almost hysterically. And there's a body in the ruins, a corpse. Maynard, did you hear me? A corpse? Probably a bum, Cynthia, probably a bum. Next chapter. I wasn't born for this. Hell, I shouldn't have been born at all if it wasn't for a drunken serviceman. The first time was prime time, and Marie Blanchard found herself with a baby in her belly and one of the best in the country, unwilling to step up to the plate. If he had done that, he probably would have ended up behind bars anyway. Instead, he ended up in the clutches of a very angry and determined Charles P. Maynard, who grabbed the boastful son of a bitch outside a dusty bottle shop in Port Allen, Louisiana, and offered him death at the hands of a 58-year-old grandfather with steel blue eyes and an iron grip. But no one ever saw hide or tail from him again. Charles P. Maynard was an irritable man who eventually died at the age of 87. He was also my great-grandfather and the only real father I ever knew. My mother's relatives were killed in a car accident when she was young, and Charles became her guardian. I don't know the whole story, but it was decided to name me Maynard in his honor, Maynard Blanchard, 2 family names. The Maynard family grew up to be scrappy, moderately successful people. Charles was a lumber merchant, rich in land, he said, with an empty wallet. Of course, he was exaggerating. We never lacked for anything. Every year he took us on vacation to the Gulf Coast, and Christmas was always plentiful. My mother married a pharmacist when I was 13, and I chose to stay with Charles in Baton Rouge rather than move with her to Mobile when given the choice. In retrospect, it was a good thing. She ended up running off with a trucker to Mexico and then settling in Sacramento, California. I still get picture postcards from her from time to see how she's doing, even though we've only seen each other a couple times since Charles died. It was graduating from LSU many years ago that set me on the path I am on now. I earned a degree in civil engineering and was hired by a New Orleans firm that needed a road warrior, someone who could live out of a suitcase and work anywhere at short notice. The pay was good, the work was interesting, but I literally had no home or place to live. I lived exclusively in a hotel room unless I was returning for the weekend, in which case I stayed with Charles. Next chapter. I caught a glimpse of her at a hotel bar in downtown Jackson, Massachusetts. By that time, I had been working on the road for a couple years and doing work at a large construction site a couple blocks from the hotel. I took another sip and slowly made my way toward her, stopping here and there. I didn't want to be obvious. She kept in the company of 2 other women, girls, I'd say. All of us were in our early 20s. "Don't you work at the new site?" she asked straight to the forehead before I could introduce myself. "Yes, ma'am, I do engineering work for them. I'm Maynard Blanchard. Nice to meet you." I shook her hand politely. "Nice to meet you, Maynard. I'm Cynthia Dawes, and these are my friends, Priscilla and Candace. Are you going to work on this site until it's finished?" Both friends looked me over from head to toe, and Cynthia smiled pleasantly. As long as they have me. I bought the next round of drinks and had a long conversation with the 3 of them, and that night I would have entertained any or all of them if I had the chance. They knew it too, and were just awful about it. Every one of them was an inveterate idiot. I learned that Cynthia worked in the office building across from the construction site, but she didn't share anything else. She must have seen me at the construction site from her office, is what I assumed. After an hour of talking to them, 3 well-dressed men approached the group, and it felt like I was about to become the odd spoke in the wheel. One of them, a guy named Michael Bishop, who looked to be in his early 30s, was obviously Cynthia's current interest, and I could feel the testosterone stoking the flames of his ego. It didn't matter to me. He was a soft, white-collar guy who didn't look like a man who worked hard. If his self-confidence fooled him with false bravado, I'd beat his ass to the sidewalk, but there was no need. I was just dating the wrong ladies, so after finishing the evening with a shot of red on the rocks, I headed to my room. The next night, I was sipping a beer at the bar of the same hotel, trying to catch a little bit of the game on TV when she lowered herself into the seat next to me. This time, she was wearing only jeans and an old, misty shirt and sandals. The bright red lip gloss was gone, too, replaced by a soft pink shade. "Do you miss me?" she asked. "I've been pining for my beer all night." I chuckled. "The more important question is, does Mr. Bishop miss you?" "Oh, don't worry about him. He's busy." I didn't worry about him one bit, and 45 minutes later we were upstairs. A couple nights later, it happened again, and it went on like that for the next month or so until Cynthia stayed the night at my place. Over breakfast the next morning, she shared a couple of interesting pieces of information. First, she worked for her dad, who was also the real estate developer, who owned the project I was working on across the street from her workplace. Second, she was announcing her engagement to Michael Bishop at a dinner party on Friday night. "So why are you here with me?" was my immediate question. "Because I like you, and you're really good." Those are 2 very good reasons under other circumstances, but as soon as a ring is put on her finger, they turn into pathetic excuses. I liked her too, and she was damn good in bed. She continued, "Maynard, it's really not that simple. I was fascinated by you as soon as I saw you trying to sneak into our side of the bar the other night. When I first saw you, I knew you were special, different. But Mr. Bishop has a little more special sauce, huh? I wasn't being flippant, or at least I wasn't trying to feel offended or upset by this turn of events. In fact, I was curious. It's complicated. I'm sure it is. Really, really, seriously." "Oh, shit," she replied with a half-smile. "Bishop and Dawes is Dad's company now since he bought out most of Michael's father's stock years ago. Michael is the senior vice president at the company, and we've known each other forever. Well, he was my first at a tender age, and over the years it was always assumed that one day we would be husband and wife. Dad has always taken Michael under his wing since Mr. Bishop died a few years ago. Maynard, you probably wouldn't understand. It's the way things are in our families. I've been engaged to him always. This only formalizes it. So I was something like the experience of sowing oats for a bride-to-be. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed every minute of it. I just felt there was more to it, that's all there is. I just didn't expect it to get so messed up. I knew what she meant to say. Money people are different from the rest of us, or they're different from us, or whatever. She was forced to marry a guy she really liked, and she tried something else she liked better, but in the end it didn't matter. In another month I'll be out of this job, and Cynthia Dawes will be Mrs. Michael Bishop of Bishop and Dawes Company. I'll be in another city with another woman, and with my eyes set on the next destination. At least that's what I told myself. "Here's to the bride-to-be," said I, raising my juice glass. Next chapter. The job ended 2 weeks early, and after resting up for a long weekend in Charles, I took a job as a project engineer for a hotel under construction in Memphis. It was a somewhat melancholy endeavor after the whirlwind of the previous few weeks with Cynthia. I pretty much stayed in, eating dinner and occasionally drinking beer at the bar. Eventually, some young Turks working on the project grabbed me one night and dragged me down to Beale Street, where they got me drunk on liquor, and I made a fool of myself. I ended up going to bed the next morning with a rather attractive middle-aged woman who had no idea what my name was, but that didn't stop her from continuing the celebration until breakfast. She was a recently divorced Bella who had just discovered that there was a whole world of men who didn't view her as a annoying property, someone to turn to. Her ex-husband had left her a year ago for a younger model, leaving her with a nice score, and now she was discovering herself and using me as her current measuring stick. I liked her resilience, or whatever they call that vigor that some women have when they discover after years of propping themselves up on the elbow of their insignificant other that they are worthy of attention in their own right, despite their ex-spouse as neglect. Bella had 2 daughters who were currently visiting their father and his new wife, so she had the weekend free, and over breakfast we decided to spend it together, exploring the town, the river, and the surrounding area. "Maynard, what are you going to be when you grow up?" she asked. She asked over the rim of her morning latte with a mischievous grin. I was thinking of becoming a gentleman farmer, but I'm not good at growing weeds on a regular basis. There was some truth in that. Charles had tried to interest me in cultivating a large tract of land on the plains of Port Hudson, just upriver from Baton Rouge before he got to Bluffs. He had 300 acres of good farmland that he bought at auction and leased to a cattleman. I just couldn't get interested in it at the time. I was going to LSU instead, and soccer and chicks were much more interesting. My first boyfriend was a farmer from Greenville, Massachusetts, where I grew up. His dad grew soybeans and anything else that would generate income. We were pretty serious until I left for school after graduation and got bitten by a shark. A shark? Yeah, my ex-husband. He was finishing up law school, and I had just arrived on campus as a pure small-town girl who had never met a real man before. Damn, that's not fair. My first now is a great guy, happy, successful, married, 4 kids, his own business. So the shark ruined you for boys? Well, I guess so. Married me 2 years later, and a couple years after that we had twins. For some reason, I thought of Marie Blanchard and how much better her life would have turned out if she had been in similar circumstances, even if her asshole husband had run off with some young stranger. Bella and I spent a great day on the river, and in the evening we took a boat tour for dinner, after which we went to my room for the night. By morning I was fully recovered and marveled at the middle-aged women and mothers. Sunday had happened again, and by Monday morning she was back in her world of mother and career woman, and the age difference of a few years was probably an obstacle to something more. Nevertheless, she left me her business card. Over the next 4 months, I finished my work in Memphis and returned to Baton Rouge to rest, and then took a planning job in the New Orleans office. This allowed me to avoid traveling across the country for the next 6 months, and by then my feet were itching for other pastures. I didn't have to wait long. "Maynard, you're going to Jackson again to see that client." Sam, my boss, told me this over lunch at Ryan's Pub on Bineville Street. "What happened at the site?" I asked curiously. "Bunk. I don't know if there was anything special about it or not. I know the client wants to redo some of the plans and wants the same guy who worked on the first job. Consider it a good recommendation." He laughed. 2 weeks later, I was in Jackson, staying at the Marriott Hotel downtown, sipping a beer at the same hotel bar where I'd parked during the first job. In the morning, I had a client meeting to attend, none other than Bishop and Dawes. Ever since I'd arrived in town, I couldn't get the memory of Cynthia Dawes out of my mind. and as I walked through the brass doors of the B&D office building, I half expected her to stand there and greet me. But that didn't happen. Instead, a guy who looked like a Poindexter came out of the elevator to take me up to the 6th floor, to the project department. He led me through many cubicles and offices with windows, and then opened up a large conference room half filled with lots of people. "Mr. Blanchard, I'm glad we were able to hire you. Welcome to Bishop & Dawes. I'm Cecil Dawes, and we will now move on to introductions." I estimated he was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, and was without much of the potential one would expect from people of good wealth. Coffee and Danish food were brought to everyone, and as we sat down, Mr. Dawes began the introductions. If he hadn't recognized me when we first met, Michael Bishop hit it well. The project itself was worth the trip. B&D wanted to build a large atrium on the other side of the creditor's state building and connect it with a sky bridge or wide underground fairway with retail and grocery stores along the way. Their architects drew sketches of both proposals, and throughout the day we discussed the specifics of the project. At the conclusion of the day's work, Mr. Dawes excused himself for business and several staff members and I planned dinner for the evening. Michael Bishop excused himself on personal business. As we shook hands, all I could think about was how delightful his wife was making love. And then he said, "Impressive, I like his plans for the atrium." I managed to get out. Nancy must have been aware of what Cynthia was doing because she had such a subtle, sly Mona Lisa. The thing is, I made it a rule never to have fun with married women. When you entertain a married woman, Maynard, the following happens. First, you mess with something that doesn't belong to you. You might as well break into a man's house and piss on his carpet. Second, you have no respect for yourself for having fun with a woman who can do that to her man. And finally, you better get out of town quick, because more men have died because of this than because of Popo. Find yourself a woman who isn't attached to some other idiot, and your personal life will be pretty damn enjoyable. There are millions of them out there. Trust me. I was about 15 when he told me that, and I was doing housework for a woman whose husband was a truck driver. Charles knew of her reputation as a stranger hunter and her predilection for much younger guys. It was good advice. Her husband caught her in bed with a guy from Prairieville and shot both of them. He didn't kill either of them, but he spent 6 years in Dixon, and she still walks around with shackles. It was getting harder and harder to take Charles's advice that night, but here Cynthia made it easy. After a couple drinks and a chat, she and Nancy parted with a hug and a kiss. I ended up sitting at the bar contemplating whether I should finish my beer or go upstairs to manually deal with my frustration. I compromised and did both. The rest of the week passed in hassles and meetings of all the major parties involved in the project, and by the end of the week, everyone had stopped on the approach to the Sky Bridge. I called my office to let them know I was staying the following week to review our participation in the project. I hadn't seen Cynthia since the night of our dinner, and Friday night I watched people partying at the bar. The retro disco band had already thundered away, and the sounds of covers of KC and the Sunshine Band. Cynthia led us out onto the dance floor and demonstrated how to be impeccably dressed, keeping her eyes on me the entire time. The next time we did a slow number, I noticed a ring on her finger. It wasn't a big sparkling stone. It didn't look like an engagement ring at all. It was a simple little ring with an opal in the center. "Don't you think Mr. Bishop will be a little alarmed to find his woman in the arms of another man tonight? He's leaving for a party in Houston for a couple of classmates from Ole Miss. He'll be back just in time for your meeting with the team Monday morning." "Well, that's not exactly what I meant," I replied questioningly. The song ended, and I recommended that we grab our drinks and sit down at a table. I meant that I'm sure he wouldn't appreciate me entertaining his woman this evening. It makes for uncomfortable dinner conversation, don't you think? Oh, I'm sure he'd be a little upset to see me working up to my 7th sweat with a bun like you, but I know for a fact that I have no reason to tell him that. "So why didn't you go to the party with him?" I asked. "I don't know any of those people, and to tell you the truth, I hate those kinds of events, especially in Houston. Besides, I'd rather be here with you." At this point, she excitedly stood up, started waving her arms and yelling, "Over here, over here!" Standing at the bar were 3 friends, each wearing heels and similarly styled dresses. Priscilla, Candace, and Nancy, who was out that evening, walked over and pulled another table over to the one we were sitting at. "I see you found your beefcake." Candace grinned. Will you be sharing? All four of us found it pretty damn funny, and in the midst of the beauty, I could only smile with them and thank my lucky stars. Truth be told, if it weren't for the ring on Cynthia's hand, I would have preferred the table to remain between the two of us. As it was, I could only savor the flavors of each of the women, not an easy duty, as one might think. At the rest of the evening passed in a quick study of how all four women moved on the floor slow and fast. Candace wasn't kidding about sharing, and she made her intentions clear, especially in the slower numbers. Unfortunately for her, and probably for me, Cynthia stepped in. There are plenty of males here for her to play with. She whispered in my ear while I was on the dance floor. Maybe, but she seems interested in Cajun cuisine, and I know a thing or two about savory recipes. I know it all too well, don't I? That's how the conversation went, and by the time we sat down at the table again, Candace and Nancy had managed to hook up with a couple of very lucky young men, and I was calculating my losses. Don't look so glum, Mr. Blanchard. The night is still young. Cynthia smiled broadly. Priscilla, let's dance. With those words, I left Mrs. Cynthia Dawes Bishop seated at the table, and Priscilla began to rouse me. Do you know that she intends to repeat the fabulous night you two had before she and Michael had the announced dinner? Maybe so, but my long-established code of conduct tells me Michael's bishop has nothing to worry about. She only grinned to herself and looked around the room with a brief glance. Oh dear, I don't see Mr. Bishop at all, and she burst into gleeful laughter as we returned to the table. By then the others had returned, and Cynthia ordered around the table. Here's to a lovely evening, ladies. Mr. Blanchard and I have more important business to attend to. This way, came in unison from all three young women as I sat in bewilderment. All three rose and rejoined the crowd. Now, Maynard, shall we go and see if the maids have fluffed your pillows well? She was transforming into a seductress before my eyes, and Charles's admonitions were ringing in my ears. Don't entertain a married woman, don't. Cynthia, I don't think you've forgotten how I feel about running after another man's woman. I'm just not like that. She looked at her ring finger, and her face instantly perked up. Oh, this? Oh, I can take care of that. She took the ring off her finger and put it in her clutch. There, now I'm no longer married, and you can run after your woman, Maynard. She purred. Charles had never told me about a scenario like this, so I was a little confused. Seriously, Maynard? Michael and I never married. Take me upstairs and I'll tell you all about it in the morning. The look on my face must have spoken volumes because Cynthia rose from the table and taking my hand led me toward the elevator. Of course, I just followed her like a fly caught in Charlotte's web. I missed her dearly when I found her again. I just didn't realize how strong a spell she had cast over me. It was so good. There was little I wouldn't have agreed to for her. The next morning, she told me her story over Danish coffee. Well, you see, we had an announcement party, and Michael went and put a huge diamond on my finger. It was all good, except there was one nasty girl, and of course she made sure she was heard. After Daddy published the ad in the paper, she must have realized she'd been duped. Who's she, interposed I? His mom, of course, and not just any mom, mind you. Michael knocked up Miss Monique Pressler, whose family bank finances almost every major project in Mississippi, including several of Dad's businesses, including lending state. Dad took him aside and asked him if what Pressler was telling him was true, and he admitted it. We're a little old-fashioned, Maynard. In some families, mine and the Pressler family included, you should knock up one of the precious baby daughters and you've already got a wife. She laughed. So the marriage was called off, and it stayed that way for a while until Michael and Monique had their big wedding. I must have been angry at first, but I quickly got over it. I figured I was saving myself for you. Even I found that funny. So what now? I asked. You're going to be my husband, and we're going to live happily ever after here in Jackson. She was so sure of herself that I was even beginning to believe it. Why does your father still keep Bishop around? Family obligations, plus I asked him to. I still like Michael. He screwed up, but he gave his kid a name and didn't run away or anything. He just won't be my husband, but you are. I'd rather you sleep with that hot mommy you were with in Memphis than marry a rich, spoiled girl in fancy pants like that. I bet she'll make you sign a prenup, too. If she does, make her sign one, too. Hell, you'll be wallowing in the mud when I get my act together. He growled that and poured another shot. Charles was like this most of the time. He enjoyed my exploits with Bella, but he was serious about the prenup. I was his only heir, and one day I would have more dirt in the form of land than I knew what to do with. He had one last piece of advice about Cynthia that I wish I had paid more attention to. Son, if you marry this girl, keep your eyes open and mind your own business. These rich people have a different morality altogether. They can't help it. That's the way they were brought up. And you, while you're damn near a Kunas, or at least you would be if your mama, God rest her soul wherever she is. California Charles, I interrupted. Oh yeah, anyway, we have our own ways of dealing with rich, swaggering assholes. If some guy in a damn fancy suit starts running after your woman, just remember this. There's more than one alligator in these coves that don't mind eating blue blood. Yeah, he's old school, I thought at the time. Cynthia and I got married after a long talk with Papa Dawes. I had to remember not to laugh when I remembered that nickname, but he was serious. There were rules of propriety to becoming a member of the family, and it was my great privilege. All in all, Cecil Dawes was a good and fair man. I agreed to keep his daughter in Jackson when my company allowed me to work in the local office in Jackson, rather than commuting to New Orleans. I still had to travel a lot, though Cecil did his best to convince me to join him, though I refused every time. Eventually, the company promoted me to regional manager, and I stopped traveling for the most part. Next chapter. And the first few years of marriage were what many would call blissful. We picked each other's bones regularly and often. Sure, I had to put up with the expected dinners and grand events thrown at the Dawes estate with all their pretentiousness, but I didn't mind Daddy Dawes at all. I could talk to him like a man, not some cowardly subordinate, and he didn't take offense. Shortly before our 4th anniversary, there was a rapid separation of events that disrupted all expectations and plans for the future. The first event was the sudden death of Cecil Dawes on the afternoon of a charity golf tournament. He dropped dead of a heart attack, rolling over like an empty sack. His wife, Emily, did not miss a beat. Kinship ties should be noted first and foremost. Cynthia's mother died when she was just a little girl, and Cecil married Emily when Cynthia was 14. The love between the two women never faded over the years, but Cecil had the wisdom to take care of Cynthia, ensuring his second wife had enough influence and prestige to keep her happy and listened to. Upon Cecil's death, my wife inherited 45% of her father's estate. 35% went to Emily, and he left me 20%. This was also the voting shares of B and D. Emily also won a seat on the Bishop and Dawes Board of Directors and colluded with the majority of the board to put Michael Bishop in charge of the company. After receiving dividends from the inheritance, Cynthia retired from the firm at the ripe old age of 27 and engaged in charitable community work. Emily, on the other hand, married Michael Bishop's father-in-law, the respected Fox Pressler. As a result, there was cross-pollination on the boards of both family firms. Cynthia simply showed no interest unless there was a board meeting or investor conference she was required to attend. The second major event was the death of Cynthia's maternal grandmother. Mabel Nason had been Old Capital since the war between the states, when a great-great-grandfather or some such had providentially converted most of his holdings outside his antebellum home into bullion, which was stored in ample quantities away from the prying hands of the Union. Mabel left the sprawling house to Cynthia, and spouses Maynard Blanchard and Cynthia Dawes Blanchard settled into about a third of the rooms of the stately mansion along Natchez Trace. Finally, my mentor and only blood relative east of the Mississippi, Charles P. Maynard, passed away, tired of life at the age of 87. He left me everything he owned, including a house in Baton Rouge. He once told me that he would leave something to my mother if he could find out where the hell she was. Mother returned to Baton Rouge for the funeral, and I have to say that for a 45-year-old woman on her third marriage, she looked very good. She was California-style healthy, with a good tan, and she had everything going for her. The man with her was some 60-year-old gold digger who probably kept her around for the sake of his wallet. Marie Blanchard Parker Simpson had struck gold in Sacramento with Arthur Simpson III, who had bequeathed her a bloody fortune when he died of a heart attack 3 years earlier. Charles lived to laugh about it, and here she was, presiding over his rather unobtrusive funeral. He'd allowed only Mom, me, Cynthia, his lawyer, and the little widow he kept on the side even in his old age to attend. After we covered him with several buckets of his own dirt, well, technically it was supposed to be my dirt, We all sat down in the living room of Charles's big house, and the attorney read his will. As mentioned, I was the sole heir, but there was a letter addressed to me in it asking me to give people what I saw fit. We did not discuss the details, but I saw fit to give a small allowance to the comforting widow. The mother was not interested in anything, so we concluded the matter and went back to our business. When the dust settled, I was what Charles always called a land-rich man with an empty wallet. I had land holdings in Louisiana, Mississippi, and East Texas, mostly timberland and some leased farmland. Had a modest bank balance and 2 commercial buildings in downtown Baton Rouge along with a house. I instructed the attorney to keep it all in a portfolio, and I would periodically manage the investments. The rental income continued to flow into the bank account as before, under my control. I really didn't have time for it. Work kept me busy, and with Cynthia's schedule, I left most matters up to the attorney. Next chapter. All the members of Cynthia's rag parade, as I called them, married successfully and led leisurely lives somewhere in the crossroads of the South, as Jackson is sometimes called. Priscilla and Candace both married wealthy attorneys, each at least a dozen years older than their brides. Nancy hit it off with a former Ole Miss soccer hero who was a state senator at the time and was going to run for Congress when he managed to raise enough money to pull it off. In their spare time, they preferred to lodge at the Nason House on Natchez Trace, with Queen Cynthia holding court. I suppose I didn't mind much. They were all great eye candy, and given the near absence of poolside clothing, I enjoyed many a day just sipping a beer in the eye shade. Married life continued quietly for both of us, and for the next few years there was nothing unusual or questionable until what I called the conversation occurred. "Nancy, have you decided who you're going to take to replace Beau?" asked Priscilla one afternoon. By the pool. I was working in the pump station trying to fix one of the salt filters and just minding my own business. "Girl, I tried out a couple of them last week and Ben turned out to be a damn fool. He could only get it up once and that was just to get it started. Santos, that guy on the other hand, is a different matter. That bastard plows on autopilot one after the other just like a goddamn ever-ready." "Damn, that sounds like goddamn Michael, huh, Miss Blanchard?" said Candace a little louder, turning to my wife. "Jesus, woman, keep it down! He's right in the house," she replied, nodding at the house and turning to me, breaking into quiet laughter as she did so. "These are things husbands don't need to know about, you know?" "Amen," Priscilla added. "Although, girl, I don't see why you need Michael with your own supply of prime to take care of this case. There isn't a respectable woman among our acquaintances who doesn't keep a man on the side unless she's some poor girl who can't afford it," interjected Nancy. Cynthia giggled along with the others, then added, "If Michael hadn't entertained me, there wouldn't have been anyone else. That's just the way it is. So, Nancy, is Santos the one?" That was the end of the conversation, and I retreated into the house through the service entrance. We had been married for over 12 years by then, and given how I was feeling at the moment, another 12 minutes might have been too long. I poured a cold beer and retreated to my private mail space in the wine cellar, deciding that the conversation needed a plan. The young woman was in her early 20s, but looked many years younger. The young woman was a regular at a bar in downtown Baton Rouge, working at a law firm and spending her free evenings learning the intricacies of 9-ball and becoming quite adept at handling the cue. She beat me in 3 games, and eventually I started buying her drinks until the young lady agreed to entertain me in the large bedroom of the house Charles had left me years ago. Part of the plan was to get back on the road, or at least give the appearance of doing so. Rather than waste miles on frequent flights, I decided to make frequent visits to the old house and look after the briefcase the old man had left in my care. I spent half my time in Baton Rouge, a third managing my assets, and the remainder in the delightful lair of my beautiful and adulterous whore wife. Cynthia's father owned a house on the banks of a reservoir at the headwaters of the Pearl River, which she had purchased from Emily Pressler. It became her personal refuge and retreat. I wasn't attracted to the place in the slightest, just a house on a large, secluded lot in the lake area. She seemed to spend a lot of time at the lake accompanied by one particular suitor. The escape in my mind was down into the Atchafalaya Basin, where Charles always kept a large boat tied up, only accessible by boat. And unless you were an experienced raccoon, you needed a GPS locator to get there. That's where the key elements of the plan came into play. Sure, you can do all that and more if you have the smarts, this giant with big colored ears told me while sipping a warm, flat beer. Rudy Cormier sat in a cushioned chair on the porch, overlooking the tethered end of the houseboat we called camp, fending off the occasional trickle of smoke from the thick cigar in the corner of his mouth. He was the baby of the family, the youngest son of Manfred Cormier, nefarious but trustworthy if you were related or close to him, and a longtime friend of Charles when he was alive, especially in his youth. That we're going to have to push all this stuff off the shore and move it around so it doesn't resurface. You know what I mean? Rudy continued. Tell you what, if you get it there, they'll never see it again, but it'll cost you. Rudy knew I was willing to pay for what needed to be done, and he and his team were the ones who would get it done right without anyone else's prompting. We agreed on the details, and then went back to having fun inside the boat. When I got back to Jackson, Cynthia was at the lake house. At least that's what her GPS locator app showed me. I could have confirmed that, of course, but I didn't need to at that point. I could have watched any number of digital videos taken here on the trail, or turned on the broadcast from the lake. Anyway, after a while, when the anger passed, I got bored. She's just obsessed with technology. Shortly after the conversation, I hooked up both places, and a week later I had a video from one of the guest rooms where I watched two long-time lovers enjoying a bottle of Bordeaux. In retrospect, I regretted not turning on two-way audio in the room so I could applaud their performance, but that would have been a bit premature. Either way, I needed to put my plan into action. Cynthia, why don't you sell your stake in the company and put it into more profitable investments? The dividend stream can't compete with what the markets are offering now. I asked her one night at dinner. She hadn't thought about it because she had become lazy and complacent, like a spoiled little rich girl, even at age 37. I worked on the issue until she agreed to talk to a broker to see what her options were. I had just such a broker in mind. Rudy Cormier, despite all his backhanded attributes, knew how to put on a suit and look appropriate. He'd been doing it for years. He could be a giant with a big ass, but he dressed well, and the ladies usually liked that. Cynthia ate him up, and he talked her into going to dinner with him. Rudy convinced Cynthia to sell her stock in Bishop and Dawes if she could get a high valuation on the goodwill. It would net her nearly $15 million after taxes and fees, and would get her considerably more than the 2% dividend she was now receiving on those shares. When it was done, Cynthia invested the proceeds in half a dozen legitimate accounts, and B&D became a minority-owned investment bank in New Orleans with at least a dozen levels of ownership that led nowhere. Later, I listened as she relayed this information to Michael Bishop. "You did what?" he growled. "I transferred the stock I inherited into several investment accounts and got a nice appraised value for it. That will double my annual income at least." She replied, "Damn it, Cynthia, my job is on the line. I have a family trust, but the new owner is putting my job in jeopardy. I thought he was going to cry, but he didn't. Show me what you did so I know it's okay." The two of them jumped off the bed and ran to the upstairs office where Cynthia pulled up her accounts online and showed Michael the results of the transfer. He knew she'd gotten a damn good price, better than anyone else who'd ever contacted them. If she hadn't been such a goddamn slut, I might have felt better about getting such a good deal. I was past the point where I didn't care about Cynthia's loyalty. Charles's admonition had haunted me a couple times. I had to take care of business. Watching her have fun with her lifelong lover, which by the way was supposed to be me, fueled my desire to make things right, which meant I needed to turn my attention to Michael Bishop. All I needed was an alligator with a predilection for chicken shit. He had been CEO of B&D for over 9 years and had settled comfortably into the position with only moderate success. However, with the support of his father-in-law's wife and Cynthia's adoptive mother, Emily Pressler, Michael Bishop decided that an atmosphere of arrogance and privilege suited him better than others. Add to that the fact that he was entertaining my wife, one of his chief benefactors, and the stench of his lover was beyond me. Still, I had to hang on. I continued to give my powers of attorney to Emily Pressler, and with her, Bishop continued to play his part in the big corner office. A certain investment firm on Canal Street in New Orleans was in no hurry to change things just yet. Cynthia was getting sloppy. The two of them were leaving an empty bottle of their precious French Bordeaux in the guest room. thinking the maid would pick it up. He even forgot a pair of 24-karat gold monogrammed cufflinks, leaving them on the bedside table. As it seemed to me, feeding time was coming to an end. Next chapter. The trigger was pulled when I met with Emily Pressler and informed her that I was turning my proxy over to Manicourt and Sizemore, a private equity firm out of New Orleans. They would make their move at the next quarterly board meeting. I already knew that Emily would immediately inform Michael Bishop of his impending doom, and the first person he'd blab to would be my wife. Those bastards, your husband gave his proxy votes to those idiots you sold your shares to. Do you realize what that means? Do you understand? Cynthia looked at him a little puzzled. You have a family trust, Michael. What's the problem? He looked at her with amazement on his face. Cynthia, my salary is 3 times what I get from trust sources. He threw his wine glass into the fireplace with anger. That's all well and fine for you. You sit on millions and live at your pleasure. She tried to soothe him, but in doing so, she added fuel to the fire of his anger. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of you. She may have meant it, but for an aunt who considers himself an alpha dog, being perceived as a kept woman is a bit humiliating. He removed her from his lap and jumped to the floor before grabbing his jacket and walking out the front door. I, of course, was watching the action over the remote channel. You need to go back to Jackson and play at home, Maynard. Rudy Cormier said this with a small smirk and a hint of gold in the upper corner of his mouth. It's time to play ball. With those words, the wheel started turning and I headed back to Natchez Trace. Cynthia had left for the afternoon and the house was quiet except for the little shit dog who sat there looking at me like I was trespassing. One of the amigos had gotten her a purebred little Yorkie for her birthday, and he never learned to stop shitting on the kitchen floor. An hour later, he was locked up at the local Animal Welfare Society, and I was back in the house. Call me an angry, neglectful creep. I don't care. I never heard her come in that night, and when I woke up the next morning, I was out of the house before she could wiggle her toes. By the time I got back around lunchtime, she was getting ready to leave the house again. Maynard, I'm going to go away to the lake house for a few days to unwind and clean up a bit. My wife of 14 years told me as I sat on that awful couch, and I could never get over the fact that Cynthia liked the setting. But it was her home, and it wasn't a big deal to me as long as I had my own safe zones to retreat to when I needed to. Right now, it didn't matter in the slightest. A few minutes later, she drove out of the house and headed for the lake while I lounged by the pool and quickly straightened up a 6-pack of Landshark Lager's beer. I know it's a light beer, but I like it anyway. I needed the beer to answer her last call. Maynard, the house, the lake house, Maynard, there was a fire. She spoke almost hysterically, and there's a body lying in the rubble. Maynard, did you hear me? A dead body? Probably a bum, Cynthia. Probably a bum was my half-drunken reply. When Cynthia pulled up to the lake house, it was already completely engulfed in flames. It was a smoking hulk of ashes and charred logs with police and firemen crowding around it. Picking through the wreckage, the firemen found a partially charred body in a bedroom. In a state of hysteria, the police officers tried but failed to get any cognitive answers from Cynthia and postponed the questioning until a later hour. By the time they succeeded, investigators quickly determined that arson was involved. Whoever set the fire was careless and amateurishly used too much accelerant to start the fire. 2 investigators showed up at the house around 5 p.m. that evening and asked to question me about what I knew or understood about what had happened. Fortunately, my attorney had arrived early to discuss a number of investment matters, including my current ownership of Bishop & Dawes stock. Of course, everything coincided in timing. Mr. Blanchard, can you explain your whereabouts from the time you left the house this morning to the time you returned just before noon? My attorney intervened. Is Mr. Blanchard under suspicion of any wrongdoing? He is considered a material witness until we determine otherwise. I'm sure you understand, counsel, replied one of them. My attorney simply nodded at me. I had breakfast in a business meeting with Emily Pressler at her home with her husband Fox Pressler until he had to leave for another event. I arrived at 9 a.m. and left just before 11:30. Of course, they can both confirm that, and I'm sure the GPS readings on my phone will confirm it as well. Are you familiar with a man named Michael Bishop? Of course, I am familiar with him. He's the CEO of a company I own a stake in, my late father-in-law's firm. He's an old childhood friend of my wife's. He's Fox Pressler's son-in-law. They muttered among themselves, asked a few more clarifying questions, and after a few pleasantries withdrew. Cynthia appeared just after they left. "Maynard, the police, they think the body in the fire is Michael, our Michael." I looked at her with an expression of almost disgust on my face. "Who's Michael?" "Michael Bishop. You know who I'm talking about." "Of course I do," I smiled. She gave me a strange look and went upstairs. I didn't follow her and walked my lawyer to his car, then walked around the pool and settled down on the patio. Over the next few days, circumstances and evidence shifted as investigators and others traveled to Match's trace. The forensic lab and the coroner determined that the body found among the debris at the lake was not Michael Bishop's, but that it belonged to an unknown, unidentified man who was found with Michael's bridge in his mouth, carelessly placed there along with his wallet. It was a very feeble attempt to give the impression that Bishop had died in the fire and to add to the mystery he had not been seen since he left his office a week ago. Investigators contacted the Presslers and discovered that Michael was soon to leave B&D after the quarterly directors' meeting. And 2 days earlier, to Cynthia's horror, it was revealed that her investment accounts had been emptied, transferred to several offshore accounts, and then reallocated elsewhere a few days earlier. One piece of curious evidence was a piece of paper in a desk in Michael's office that had an account number on it. FBI experts traced it to a Costa Rican bank account that received $1.5 million from a Cayman Islands bank and was then emptied of money transactions over the past 3 days. They also found a record of an airline ticket purchased in the name of Michael Bishop's and a man matching his description who had boarded a flight to Costa Rica a week ago. Cynthia couldn't explain how Michael could have accessed her accounts, and she certainly wouldn't talk about her long-time affair with him, especially when I was in the room. At this point, her only hope was that they would find him and her stolen wealth. Long after they had left, I found her sobbing in her study. "I have to go to Baton Rouge in the morning, Cynthia. Are you going to be okay here with all this going on?" She nodded her head. "Maybe the 3 amigos can stop by and help?" I slept like a baby that night and loaded a couple suitcases in the morning, and if Cynthia noticed anything missing, she didn't mention it. The car stopped in the driveway, and I looked back at old Mabel Nason's house and remembered Charlie's frequent saying. She was land rich with an empty wallet, literally, and laughed almost all the way to Baton Rouge. In retrospect, I felt like a cheap skate for a while, so I topped up the bill for Cynthia. The amount wasn't enough to pay for her trouble-free life, but if she took it and the fire insurance payments, she could provide enough of an allowance to live modestly in her expensive home. I also didn't want any unwanted attention drawn to us. I had planned to file for divorce against her, but decided to leave it at that. I didn't want publicity, so I made frequent trips to Jackson to pay my respects to the couple. One evening we spent with Cynthia on the banks of the Pearl River, where we had a come-to-Jesus meeting. It was well after the police and FBI had left and gone about their business. "Cynthia, why was Michael Bishop found on the lakeshore?" She didn't want to answer at first, and before she could answer, I stepped in. I'll put it as plainly as only this simple Louisiana boy can. "I'm going to assume that you've been having an ongoing affair with that son of a bitch for years. Now, before you answer me, think carefully. You don't know what I know. And you better believe there are enough good old boys in the bayou who can make a small group of silly Jacksonian girls squeal the truth until their lungs burst with energy. Do you know what I'm talking about? If so, tell me the whole damn truth, starting from the beginning." Her lips quivered, and I thought she was about to cry, but she didn't. Instead, she went to the beginning and confirmed what I already knew. What I didn't already know shocked me, and afterward I walked her home in silence. When I was in Jackson, I was a loving husband, but the dynamic had changed. I was not Cynthia Dawes Blanchard's husband, she was Maynard Blanchard's wife, and she wasn't going to forget that as long as I allowed her to remain so. How long that would last? I didn't know. Michael was now considered the instigator of the fire, the deception and theft of Cynthia's account balances, and was on the FBI's active wanted list. Somehow I doubted he would surface. For the most part, Cynthia was back to her old self. But every now and then I noticed the fear lurking somewhere inside her gaze. She was still beautiful. Men were still chasing her, and as far as I could tell, her friends were still having fun with their husbands. But since she was still under surveillance, I never once saw her take part in their festivities. I was reminded of her words that she said when I first heard this conversation. If Michael hadn't entertained me, there wouldn't have been anyone else. That's just the way it is. That may have been the impetus behind the creation of the plan. Next chapter. The creaking of wooden planks made the boat sail in the wind while squalls of tropical rain flooded everything in its path. It wasn't a hurricane, but any tropical storm is worthy of respect in the wilderness. When I was a boy, Charles used to bring me here to the Atchafalaya Basin. To make a man out of me, he said. And it worked. One day when I was 14, he left me here alone for a week. I had a couple pounds of beans and a short bundle of sausages and all the condiments I could get in the galley, mostly Cajun seasoning and hot sauce with pepper, salt, and thyme, and garlic and onion powder. I also had plenty of food on hand, as long as I could keep them from biting off. Crayfish and catfish were in abundance for the patient man or boy. Through this experience, I learned to live on my own in America's largest bayou network. I was not alone in this regard. Rudy Cormier, his brother Damien, and an elderly Creole man named Pierre Monet had similar experiences. Each of them could slip away unnoticed, come and go through these swamps without being caught, and on the other hand, nothing escaped their notice. Pierre Monet sat in a corner on a short stool, listening to the incessant rain pounding on the tin roof. His bloodshot white eyes framing his coal-black face. Only the gleam of reflected light gave him a human appearance. His gaze was fixed on a figure in the opposite corner, flinching at his silent stare. A few moments earlier, Pierre's long, bony fingers had been playing a small ukulele, breaking the silence along with the accompanying soulful bursts of lyrical wishes that made the man sitting across from him flinch fearfully. It stopped before I entered the room. I lit another kerosene lantern, and the chimney cast shadows on the walls around us. Rudy Cormier sat at the table across from me. The figure in the corner raised his face, and yellow splashes of light brought to life the jagged features of what had once been a proud little peacock. The sides of his face and the corners of his mouth were bruised in the pale glow, and his eyes were sunken and unfocused. I can't read people's souls or hearts, but I could discern the horror masked on his face. He knew what he'd been through, and he knew that life itself had been worse. But it was all in the past now, just like the rain that was already falling around us. This was not Jackson or Natchez Trace. It was not even within the confines of Western civilization. If not for the keeping of clocks and calendars, it might have been the Mesozoic, if not for the 4 souls inside the floating tin hut. "So what now, Mandamus?" asked Rudy from across the table. "When the storm is over, give him his bag along with a can of beans and sausage or something and take him across the Bell River. See that he gets on the case on Chase. He ain't coming back. Now I need to have a little private talk with him." Rudy and Pierre rose from their seats and went under the awning on the port side. I stared at the broken man for a few minutes, watching what he had become. Pierre Monet led one of the commons, a Creole gang from Haiti whose tentacles stretched into some of the local communities. They tended to keep a low profile and mind their own business, although over the years they partnered with Manfred Cormier for certain needs. When I was a young boy, I remember Charles entertaining Manfred and the 2 dark-skinned Haitians into the evening. I never knew what the business was, but it was smoky and secret, and one of the Haitians cast a glance at me as I was hiding behind a curtain in the kitchen. His look scared the hell out of me, and I rushed to my bedroom, followed up the stairs by the laughter of each of the men. As lightning flashed around us, adding an eerie glow to the otherwise horrifying scene, I studied my captive for a moment longer before I spoke. "Mr. Bishop, or whatever your name will be in your next life, I'm curious to know something." He raised his eyes to me and stared into the void behind me. How can a man convince another man's wife to cuckold her husband for 14 years and believe there will never be consequences for such an insult? I don't know if he could have answered or not, but it wasn't necessary. I was being rhetorical at the moment. One person could let the lawyers handle everything and walk away, having been disgraced but still retaining the ability to hold his head high. Another could just put a bullet in your ear and piss on your corpse. Another could keep your balls in a jar standing on the shelf of an old tin rig like this one, And then there are people like me, Michael, who prefer you know that life is one constant woe after another, and you don't know when some unknown voodooist is going to add a new twist to your life. So that's where we left off today. But I still have a few questions. Do you understand me? He hesitantly nodded his head. Okay, let's get started. You and Monique have 2 children, right? Okay. When you and Cynthia were still planning to get married, well, before you were forced into this failed relationship, did you both ever talk about having children? He looked up, startled. Answer me. Yes, we did, he replied, but the words were half out of his mouth, which was missing several teeth in one bridge. She wanted children. I wonder if she wanted kids. Why do you think she and I never had kids? At this point, I realized that the purpose of my interrogation had become clear to him. If you don't tell me the truth, I'm going to cut the life out of you right here. She had a miscarriage, and after that she couldn't have children. Well, that was the truth. But I needed the spoils. How did she miscarry, and whose baby yours her mind? I looked at him intently, and he knew the answer would keep him alive or cut it short. It was your baby. How did it happen? She fell. I waited, looking at him. She fell after I hit her. Tell me the whole story. Michael Bishop got down to business and told me that Cynthia became pregnant while he was on a business trip overseas, and in anger, he hit her, causing her to fall and a miscarriage to occur. He went on to describe how he demanded that her fallopian tubes be cut and tied, depriving me of my desired child. At that moment, she belonged to him, even though she was mine. There was no way she would have told me that if she hadn't been forced to. I wanted to kill him right then, even though I already knew everything he had told me. Instead, I left everything else in the shadows and poured 3 fingers of brandy. Michael Bishop would soon be someone else and never set foot on these shores again. For the first time in our marriage, my wife had come back to me, but I didn't know if I wanted her back. That's the funny thing about women, marriage, and love. Sometimes love has nothing to do with it, at least with some Jacksonians. They marry for privilege and position, and they don't care. Michael Bishop was screwed. The 2 of them had screwed me up, and now I had to clean up the mess. The storm ended 2 days later, and Pierre Monet took a bewildered Michael Bishop out into the moonlight and put him on a small skiff that was to begin his journey to a Haitian-registered freighter called the Caisson Chase. He was given a small plastic bag containing a new ID and passport and $1,300. His backpack contained 3 changes of clothes and several cans of Kipper snacks. 6 days later, the ship departed New Orleans for the Dominican Republic. He and I both knew that there was not a shadow of a doubt, not the slightest doubt, that he would never be heard from again. And if he did show up, the voodooist would massacre his tongue among other organs. Rudy Cormier and I completed what we had set out to do, restored my dignity, and in doing so, changed the lives and destinies of several people. I had to give 30% to Rudy and his associates, and 20% to Pierre Monet and his men, leaving me with half of Cynthia's fortune. I also got a new job. Next chapter. Good morning, Mr. Blanchard. My assistant Wendy greeted me with her usual cheerful banter. As I entered the newly renovated 8th-floor corner office on Laurel Street in Baton Rouge, I couldn't help but notice the sly grin on her face. Manicourt and Sizemore had held a quarterly meeting and hired me to be the CEO of Bishop & Dawes, a move from Jackson to Baton Rouge. Truth be told, I didn't know anything about running a company, but I was a damn good engineer and could learn. Plus, with Cormier's seat on Manicourt and Sizemore's board of directors, I knew I had resources I could call on. Charles's old apartment got a fresh renovation, and I moved Cynthia away from Jackson. Surprisingly, she offered no resistance and was happy to accept the change of scenery. Now about Cynthia. She gave birth to a boy whom I named Charles Maynard Blanchard, about a year after Michael Bishop disappeared into the fog of a world dominated by society and its various Pierre Monet characters. Instead of trying to repair her fallopian tubes, the doctors recommended artificial insemination using her own eggs, and it worked to our satisfaction. I decided to stay married to her despite her long-standing infidelity, if only so that she would give me the child we had promised each other. If she became infertile because of her unfaithful actions, I would leave her to her fate. But that didn't mean we had a previous marriage. I was very reserved. But I had hired Wendy as my assistant for a reason, and typing had nothing to do with it. Did it make me a kinder guy? On the contrary, I became hard and callous, even though I could smile, have fun, and have a great time with anyone. I could make love to my wife and know she wouldn't be tempted again, and I could raise my boy knowing he would make a good Louisiana man. On the other hand, somewhere out there was a man with a new name, always wondering if there was a ghost from the past waiting over his shoulder. Epilogue. 18 years after Charles M. Zarival, the creaky planks groaned softly as the wind gently pushed the dock toward the floating shack tied to the pier a few miles up the bayou chain. The storm had subsided hours ago, and now only a light breeze remained as the clouds changed to clear skies. "I have no idea why you men like coming here," exclaimed Cynthia. Charles M. only smiled at his mother and said, "This is where life begins, Mom. Everything you need to get a taste of life is right here at your fingertips." Cynthia just shook her head and continued making jambalaya while I took the corn tortillas out of the oven. Rudy Cormier sat in the corner and sipped from a corkscrew. He claims it helps him cope with the progression of his Parkinson's disease, but his body still shakes, and his arm remains unsteadied. Nevertheless, he was able to cope best with his young son Patrick Cormier and his friend Monstoul Monet, grandson of our long-gone acquaintance Pierre Monet. Together with Charles M., these three boys will be attending LSU in the fall. We continued on to dinner, and while we enjoyed a bottle of cognac on the deck afterward, I considered Cynthia. She was 55 and I was 57, and although she had put on a few pounds in recent years, she was still as attractive as when I first saw her. With the birth of our boy, I forgave her, but I never forgot her. I pulled her out of her society in Jackson, sold the Nace and house on Trace, and since we had no family in Mississippi, we had no reason to visit her except for occasional visits when we were passing through. Instead, I turned her into a Louisiana girl. She studied cooking and customs and even earned an MBA from LSU. She became the hostess of Charles's old home, now mine, in Baton Rouge. Their relationship with Wendy lasted long enough for Charles M. to become a toddler, and we parted ways. She married a lawyer and left her job to raise her own family. A few years earlier, certain channels carried the news that an expatriate named Martin Baylor had passed away in Cayenne, French Guiana, leaving behind a local common-law wife and young daughter. He made his living as a bartender at a small hotel where his wife worked as a housekeeper. I asked Rudy to find a way to get a small widow's allowance to take care of her and the baby. As we were tidying up, Cynthia was putting away a few things and came across a small container that contained an ashtray, some photographs of Rudy and Pierre Monet. Among the items was a gold ring. It was a medium-sized man's ring with a ruby stone that said "All Miss" on the top and 1,987 inches, and the initials MB on the bottom, as well as a pair of gold cufflinks with the same initials. For a few moments, she stood looking out the window at the marshes and swamps around us, and then she put it back in the tin container and set it on the shelf. When she turned back into the room, our eyes met for a moment, and I caught a glimpse of fear in the back of her mind, but it was only a moment. At that moment, Charles M. and we stood, as befits a family, deep in the wet byways of the Atchafalaya River Basin. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.